think it started with our today's event. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, the Danube Institute, and the Migration Research Institute at a professional event entitled The Prospects of Modern Terrorism from Global to Local. I'm Szabolcs Janik, Deputy Director of the Migration Research Institute. I will be today's event host and moderator. And now I would call to the floor cordially Mr. Zoltán Szalai, Director General of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, to deliver his opening speech.
Hello, I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you very much for the audience that you appeared such in a high number for this event. In 2019, when we launched the Budapest Lecture series, it was exactly our goal that we invite distinguished speakers, that we have a good audience who is interested in intellectual topics, in topics of the global world, in topics of how to understand better modern society and developments of our world and of our society and of Europe. I'm very happy that after a short pause of COVID, we could go on and we could develop a new series of Budapest Lectures. Almost every week you can meet us here at MCC with such a series. And I'm very happy that we have such nice and such great speakers like Diego Muro and Jeffrey Kaplan. Thank you very much for accepting our invitations. And to talk about this interesting and important topic about international terrorism and the prospects of violent modern terrorism. Why is it important? What are the transfers and what are the developments and the latest developments that we can see in the world, and how can the world and how Europe can fight these aspects and how can fight modern terrorism. It is a very important topic, and I'm very happy that we can have a discussion about this. And for the Budapest Lectures, it's very important that it is not just a discussion between the speakers and between the moderator, but it's also open to the floor of the audience, so you can also join and you can ask questions, and that way we can have a nice discussion. And afterwards we are very happy if you join us for our small buffet and we can have together and go on with the discussion that we start with Budapest Lectures. So thank you very much for everybody, especially for our guests to be here, and I'm very much looking forward for a very exciting discussion. Thank you very much.
Now we start our event. Today we have three genuine experts who will speak about some different aspects of contemporary terrorism issues. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Diego Muro, Senior Lecturer of the St Andrews University, Mr. Jeffrey Kaplan, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Danube Institute here in Budapest, and Mr. Viktor Marsai, Research Director of the Migration Research Institute, my colleague actually at the Institute. First, we will listen to the thoughts of our three experts separately. Then the audience will have the chance to ask questions to either or all of our speakers, and I encourage you to use the so-called slido.com platform where you can pose your questions. Here are some signs placed out on which you find information how you can pose such questions, and at the very end of our event I will ask them and address them to our speakers. And now, I kindly ask Mr. Muro to deliver his speech.
Thank you. Right, well, thank you all for being here. Thank you very much to both the Institute for the invitation. It's an honor to speak next to Jeff and Victor, great friends and great scholars. Gosh, the time is already running. I need to hurry up. There's a big sign with the time on. But thanks for everything. It's a pleasure to be back here. I was here 2 years ago before the pandemic, and it's great to be back with all of you amongst friends. And I'm going to present this paper on how countries prevent and counter radicalization. I'm not sure if you can see well from the back, But anyway, this is what I want to say. I want to tell you a little bit about the motivations of the survey and the study it belongs to. I'll say a little bit about methodology, don't worry. This is like broccoli. Methodology tastes awful, but it's good for you. Something about the survey, the main findings, and a final slide with conclusions that I thought will be of interest to you. So when we decide on a topic of research, we try to ground our interest in scholarly reasons and practical reasons. You know? When it comes to grounding our interest in radicalization, prevention, and countering violent extremism, what we see is that since the terrorist attacks of Madrid and London, the rise of the term radicalization, violent extremism, the return of foreign fighters from Syria and so on, there has been an increasing interest on what should be the tools to counter violent extremism, to prevent attacks, and for those people that have been apprehended and arrested and are under custody, to see whether they can be de-radicalized. So to see whether one can do something for them to abandon their violent ideology. So this is the practical motivation. The scholarly one is that there has been a lot of research from people that work on de-radicalization. This would be the process by which someone either abandons a radical ideology or radical behavior, and these are two completely different things. My colleague at CSTPV, Sarah Marsden, has worked on this. There's a lot of work on disengagement as well, programs that facilitate the abandonment of a terrorist group by a particular individual. But we know very little on what is the public support for CVE and PVE programs, so countering violent extremism programs and the prevention of violent extremism. We know that governments implement these programs, they give a lot of thought to it, they invite experts, but we don't know what the population thinks and whether we can find public support for these sort of initiatives. The survey I'm going to be presenting today, and there are going to be lots of slides today, so you're not going to fall asleep or anything, there are going to be drawings and stuff to look at, originates from a report that we wrote with a colleague of mine, Musa Burekba, for the Union for the Mediterranean, which is a Barcelona-based organization funded by the European Union. And within this survey, which is not public, I'm afraid, but if you're really interested, I can get you access to, we launched this large-scale survey of 8,400 individuals in 7 countries. So we carried out the research before the pandemic, and we had 1,200 individuals for these 7 countries: the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. And we asked them questions about radicalization, about perceptions of terrorism, and what sort of initiatives they would support. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are right about what they think about terrorism radicalization, as you're going to see, but it gives us some clues as to what policies are possible, what policies are more likely to get the support of public opinion. And I think this is very interesting from the point of view of policymakers. What you're going to see from now on is data separated into 2 different groups. I don't think you can see it from far back, but the light blue belongs to what we call North Mediterranean countries. So these are the 4 European countries. And the dark blue are South Mediterranean countries. This is, again, Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. And we have different questions that we pose to our 8,000 interviewees. And for example, here we ask them, does terrorism emerge in abnormal societies? We didn't tell them what an abnormal society is. We assume each one of us has a different understanding. But what we got, and this is only the first slide, we had a very nice normal distribution. Right? This is a bell curve. This is what you get, statisticians tell you, when you have a large number of responses for a regular topic. Right? So there's not much to be said here, except that the majority somewhat agree with the statement that yes, terrorism is typical of abnormal societies. What an abnormal society is, well, who knows, right? Right. Here we come to more interesting findings. Right? So here we ask respondents whether they thought that the lack of democracy was the main cause for terrorism. And what we see here is that, again, the responses are skewed to the left, meaning that the majority somewhat agree or agree very much so with the statement. But there's an interesting discrepancy between north and south of the Mediterranean, or European and North African countries, right? So what we have is that in European countries, the idea that lack of democracy somehow causes radicalization is not a statement that is followed by as many as we see in the south. And of course, when we talk about democracy here, we're not talking simply about whether the country has elections or not, because we know that many autocracies throughout the world hold elections, whether they are competitive elections, whether they are clean elections, and whether the quality of the democracy they have is high or not is the issue for debate. So our assumption here is that when people talk about democracy, it's not only elections, but the quality of democracy. This is another interesting response when we ask our groups whether poverty is the main cause of terrorism. Here we have an enormous discrepancy between North and South. People north of the Mediterranean, European countries don't think that, that poverty is a cause of terrorism, or people do not radicalize because they are poor. But this seems to be a statement that receives a lot more support in the north of Africa and Middle East. And this is interesting, it's noteworthy, but it goes against everything we know about terrorism, right? Famous paper by Kruger and Malekova, famous book by Tore Bjorg on the root causes of terrorism, tell us that it's not true that the poorest countries have higher instances of terrorism, and it's not that there's any sort of causal mechanism between poverty and radicalization. Lack of opportunities, perhaps. Weak governance, perhaps. Weak states, perhaps. But poverty as such is not a cause of radicalization. And this is interesting because this resonates with what I'm going to say. We may have public support for certain policies, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the policies are going to work, right? So we need to take with a pinch of salt what respondents are telling us. So here, for example, in the South, very much support for this statement. Poverty somehow causes radicalization. These results are robust. We had another question about lack of economic opportunities, and we got practically the same results. So this is the perception in the South. Pardon? Okay, we have another one. This is interesting as well, where the foreign policy of the West is seen to be a main cause of terrorism. And what we see here is another interesting discrepancy between European countries and southern Mediterranean countries, where the view that somehow what Western powers do in faraway lands in terms of invasions, regime change, interventions, and so on and so forth, is a direct cause or a motivation factor for the process of radicalization. And this is intuitive and it makes sense, right? People, particularly jihadists, and I think that's what people have in mind when we throw these questions, are also inspired by what's going on in Muslim lands. You know, with what went on in Bosnia, what went on in Chechnya, what's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on in Syria, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that we have different perceptions, north and south, and that's already hinting at one of my conclusions, that because the perceptions are going to be different, and possibly the problems and the causes of radicalization are going to be different depending on what country one is based, there cannot be one-size-fits-all policy. Different countries, different problems, different solutions. So the idea that one can come up with this toolkit that is applied indiscriminately is a very false expectation that we need to abandon. And the survey, I think, gives us good reasons why that is the case. Now, radical ideas as the main cause of terrorism. Again, we have a skewed distribution here. The majority of respondents seem to be in agreement, and this argument about ideology, perhaps a particular religion or a particular interpretation of religion triggering radicalization or extremism, seems to be prevalent in Europe, not so much in the southern Mediterranean countries. There's this debate, I was mentioning to one of your colleagues before, in France, there's this debate between Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy, right? These two guys have different understandings of what causes radicalization. So Gilles Kepel says there's something about ideology, a particular rigorist, sort of traditionalist, Sunni interpretation of Islam that causes terrorism. And Olivier Roy says that it's actually the opposite, it's the Islamization of radicalism. that people who have the potential to become radical take one of the ideologies off the shelf for what would be their own process of radicalization, no matter what. And I think the truth is somewhere in between these two. We cannot simply go and say it's all about the ideology, otherwise we would have many more terrorists than we currently have, and we know that this is an anomaly. But we also need to shy away from those interpretations that make no connection with ideology and think that it's all about the social setting. Because there are loads of people who are economically and socially deprived, many poor people, you know, Brazil being a very unequal society, and yet very low number of terrorism incidents, right? So inequality, the social aspect, doesn't explain everything. This is interesting. Here we ask respondents whether they think it's the lack of religious knowledge that is the main cause of terrorism. And this is fascinating, I think, because this is an answer where the majority of respondents in Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan agree to much higher numbers than in their European counterparts. So from the perspective of our respondents in the South, terrorism would be somehow a perversion, an anomaly of their religion. The ideology, the religion does not necessarily lead to radicalization, and even less so terrorism. So there's an attempt, popular attempt by responses, to break that linkage. And we thought that this was significant, the fact that they consider terrorism to be alien to their religion. The next slide, I think it's also interesting. And I don't know how to put together the previous slides on the belief that terrorists or radicalized individuals are not very well informed about the religion they speak about, and the fact that in the South, there's a large, 42% compared to 20% in European countries, that believe that terrorists are mentally ill. There's something about, once again, terrorism being a perversion, something, a complete outlier, something that doesn't make sense. And here I also want to tell you a little bit about research on terrorism, right? The perception of these individuals goes against everything we know about terrorism. It is not true that terrorists are mentally ill. Very often, those that come from privileged backgrounds are much more likely to be part, and those who have valuable skills are much likely to be part of a terrorist groups than those that have no marketable skills or are unpredictable. Diego Gambetta and Sevan Hertog have this famous book called Engineers of Jihad. Right? And their argument is that those with high valuable skills, with education, engineers and doctors, are disproportionately represented amongst the ranks of jihad. Since Martha Crenshaw started writing on terrorism in the 1980s, there are successive rounds of scholars that say that the most common characteristic of terrorists is their normality, their normalcy. They have no more psychopathologies than the rest of us, not at all, perhaps as many of us, welcome to the club, and possibly less so. And again, this makes sense, because why would you want to recruit someone who's unpredictable, someone who's unstable for your terrorist group? You want the opposite. You want to have someone who can obey orders, who can analyze, who can improvise. You want a good soldier. So once again, this tells us valuable information about perceptions of what causes radicalization, popular perceptions, but we cannot ground progress of de-radicalization on the basis of these responses. We have to take them with a pinch of salt, which is the argument I'm trying to make here. Okay, we have another, I think I have two or three more slides. Here we have another slide that refers to whether foreign fighters can be reintegrated by country. And once again, what we see here is that support for the possibility of reintegration, of de-radicalization and reintegration in society is much lower in European countries than it is in Northern African countries. This is paradoxical, because if you think that these are mentally ill people, according to their responses, how are we going to reintegrate them? It's actually, it tells you a little bit about how contradictory responses can be. But yet, the belief is that the countries that originate foreign fighters, and in particular we know Tunisia when it comes per 100,000 inhabitants, was one of the countries that produced the highest number of foreign fighters. And again, this makes sense. Those countries that produce foreign fighters that went and volunteered with ISIS have the biggest problem when it comes to returnees, and are the ones that think that reintegration is possible. Take it to a contemporary example we know, far-right extremism, or Nazi supporters. You know, Germany, for example, has very well-established exit programs that try to do exactly this. The belief is that neo-Nazis can be de-radicalized, they can be reintegrated into their own society once they go, certain programs. So in a way, what we see is no different to what we have in Europe, with a different ideology, with a different type of violent extremism. But the belief and the goals of these programs are the same. This slide perhaps is not as surprising. This has to do with disengagement. Here we ask whether a de-radicalization program cannot be effective unless the ideological cause is addressed. And what we have once again is that support for the ideological cause to be tackled with is greater in the north than in the south. Remember that in previous slides I said that in the north we have followers of Gilles Kepel, people that think that it's all about the ideology, it's all about Islam, it's all about a particular interpretation of a religion that causes radicalization and eventually terrorism. Whereas the numbers for southern countries is lower when it comes to strongly agree, but higher when it comes to agree. My last slide, and I'll come to the conclusions very quickly. Where should states, where should governments, where should NGOs, where should de-radicalization programs be implemented and prevention programs? And what we have here is that marginalized areas come at the very top, particularly for southern countries that believe that poverty and the lack of economic opportunities are one of the root causes of terrorism. When it comes to places of worship, mosques in particular, the view we have that these need to be spaces where PVE programs, where prevention programs need to be implemented is much higher in the north. So once again, Kepel funds in Europe, Olivier Roy funds in Northern Africa. Interesting discrepancy. Those that think that prisons should be one of the main spaces is the third set of columns. And once again, education, schools, where we have pretty much the same agreement. But I want to draw this contrast between Kepel followers and Olivier Roy followers. Now, for me, the main findings of the survey, or the takeaway points I think you should take, are that in resonating with the literature, the motivations or the drivers or the explanatory causes of radicalization are multiple, and they go from mental and health resources to socioeconomic deprivation, foreign policy, and so on. The survey confirms what we already knew, even though the country differences or geographical differences are important. There's cross-national understanding or overwhelming agreement on the fact that lack of democracy, poverty, and lack of economic opportunities plus foreign policy are some of the main causes of terrorism, even though the literature has told us for years that these are not causes, these are facilitators, these are things that help terrorism, but not causes in themselves. And finally, the idea, particularly in the South, that mental illness and the lack of religious knowledge are some of the key variables that account for radicalization. I think this is one of the things we didn't know, and this emerges from the survey. I have 25 seconds. I'm going to finish on time, I promise. So what I've presented to you, and I hope that all of you are still awake by now. So I've presented you the results of a survey, 8,400 individuals in 7 countries that revolve around the Mediterranean, north and south. From the point of view of respondents, radicalization is not a single pathway, it's actually a multi-level set of variables that account for radicalization. When it comes to disengagement, those countries that produce the largest number of terrorists or foreign fighters are also the ones that are happier or are more in favor of these programs being implemented, not so much in the West that is on the receiving end, perhaps, of these attacks. And when it comes to the content of prevention progress and progress of countering violent extremism, we see that the content of these programs per country, but also per region, cannot be the same. Because the indicators, because the causes that they understood and evaluated and concluded and identified as causes of terrorism are different. So no single toolkit, I'm afraid, not much of a solution, I'm afraid. But this runs contrary to the understanding, the monolithic understanding of what the causes of radicalization are and what the causes of de-radicalization have to be. I'm afraid that reality on the ground is a bit more complex than that. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your inspiring thoughts, Mr. Muro. And now let me call to the floor our second speaker today, Mr. Jeffrey Kaplan. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to talk about the Taliban. And it's something that we all have preconceived notions about, but let me give you another view of the Taliban. The Taliban from their creation and as seen from the context of Afghan tribal society. This is the single most important point to understand. The Taliban were the product of the violence of the post-Soviet Civil War. A quick history of Afghanistan in the last 30 years. There was the jihad against the Soviets, which literally destroyed the country. Into the ruins came a vacuum when the Soviets left. And into that vacuum came what always happens in Afghanistan when there's a vacuum. There was tribal warfare and the rise of warlords, each of whom was tied to a tribal base. The Taliban were born into this kind of conflict. They began fighting the Soviets and then each other from the time they were old enough to carry weapons. So it wasn't unusual to see 10, 8, 9-year-olds on the battlefield. Here is the mythological or myth of creation of the Taliban. There is some disagreement among historians about how true it is. For our purposes, it's absolutely true because the Afghans believed it and they acted accordingly. Amazingly enough, in the Afghan context, the Taliban, first of all, were a progressive movement. Why progressive? Because they were the only non-tribal actors available. So those who were tired of fighting for tribes, those who were tired of fighting for warlords, found the Taliban's appeal quite good. Moreover, and here's the biggest surprise, in the beginning, the Taliban were perceived as the ultimate protectors of women. Why? It's an interesting story. In tribal Islamic society, wherever you go, there is a basic life cycle. And the adult life cycle is as follows. Your parents arrange for a marriage with the parents of your partner. They exchange documents. They trade the bride price for the dowry. And eventually the partners are asked if they want to do it or not. And they do. You don't refuse your parents. In a war-torn society where the system is broken, where so many are dead, where tribes are dispersed, where poverty rules, it breaks down. If you are a young fighter for a warlord, you have no access to this traditional life cycle. So what do? For the warlords, to keep their fighters happy, or at least quiet, they would provide women for them. It's not in a traditional way. The tradition then becomes you kick down somebody's door and you drag their daughters off. Not a good system. And the myth of the Taliban is that a group of young students at a madrasa, talib means students, young students at a madrasa after one of these raids got together and said, "Khalas, this is enough." And so they gathered some weapons, which is easily done in Afghanistan. Then and now, they have some wonderful arms bazaars just at the, well, I digress. That's my personal interest. But in any case, what they did is they went to the camp of the warlord involved, and they freed the women. They asked the girls, "Who touched you in any way?" And everybody, they pointed out, was hung from the turrets of tanks. When this story got around, the Taliban were the heroes of every region as the story spread by word of mouth. And pretty soon, guys were coming in droves to join the Taliban. It wasn't their religious message. It was their progressive approach. They were non-tribal. They were protecting women. This was their leadership. And a worse leadership perhaps you couldn't find for governing a society, but it was a very effective one for fighting an internal war. Mullah Omar was charismatic, as he was frankly uneducated. He grew up like all of the others around him in war. So you're not going to find a senior mujtahid, a senior scholar, in a group like that. Their ideas of Islam were basic and based on tribal custom, much more than Sharia, much more than Islamic law. But people flocked to them. In very short order, they formed roughly 1993. By 1994, they were in the field and pretty soon a national force. This is a form of terrorism eventually, or would become terrorism, that went from local to global, rather than the other way around. They established a kind of quasi-government in Kandahar, and the national treasury was said to be kept in a strong box under Mullah Omar's bed. They were that poor. So if you needed something, if you needed funds for something, you brought a script to Mullah Omar and he'd read it like it was a traditional majlis. And he'd say, "Okay, you get this much, but this is all we've got." Their finances changed for the better when Osama bin Laden went from Sudan to Afghanistan. And he helped to finance the early Taliban. He gave his bayah, and this is very important. He gave his bayah to Mullah Omar. A bayah in Arabic means an oath of allegiance. It's freely given and it's freely taken back. But in doing this, he was recognizing Mullah Omar as his leader. And there was more to this than just politics, because Mullah Omar was establishing an Islamic state when one did not exist in the Sunni world at the time. So this was very important. Well, 9/11 happened. The United States politely asked for Osama bin Laden to be turned over. And just as politely, the Taliban said, "I'm sorry, but by the rules of hospitality, we can't do it." And so the United States invaded and did quite a good job of it. They destroyed the country quite nicely. They almost got Osama bin Laden, but he escaped. And after that came the fiasco. That's another story. By 2002, however, the Taliban had very much worn out their welcome. This is a picture of some of the public floggings of women. What women soon found is, yes, they protected them from being dragged off, but they were otherwise utterly excluded from society. They could no longer work, and just to give you one anecdotal example of what that really meant, teachers were no longer teaching young children. Girls' schools were closed, but more importantly, there was no access to medicine by women. So the gynecologists who were there were female. They could no longer practice in the hospital. So at that point, women's health went down incredibly in an already impoverished society. So the Taliban had very much worn out their welcome with everybody. The public executions were no longer a form of entertainment. People were getting very, very scared. The American failure in Afghanistan is an epic story. It's a lecture in itself, but it could also be told quite simply in some ways. One, young Afghan recruits were being asked to fight for an ideology they didn't understand and had nothing to do with Afghan culture. They were being introduced to sophisticated weapons to young soldiers who were illiterate. They could not read the instructions. Moreover, pretty soon, the Americans wore out their welcome too. And so we had what was called green on blue, which meant that American instructors would have to disarm their students, those they were instructing, rather than get shot in the back. So the situation for the Americans, as for the Soviets, as for the British before them, went downhill rather fast. For those international relations specialists, the ones who are really winning out of all this is China. Even after they were removed from power, the Taliban remained influential, and through the Quetta Shura, which linked the two wings of the Taliban movement, that in Afghanistan, that in Pakistan together, the Chinese were always sending diplomats there. If you read the Chinese One Belt, One Road plan, it's fascinating because it says something that everybody knew in the first place. Afghanistan, perhaps the poorest country in the world, is potentially the richest. They are overflowing with mineral resources that if they could only be mined, would make the country and the companies, Chinese companies, by the way, quite wealthy, extremely wealthy. And one of the great ironies during the conflict is the Chinese were quietly hoping that the Americans succeeded in pacifying the country because it would open it up for Chinese business without any physical danger, without any real military or economic cost. That didn't work out, but the Chinese are still very much in the picture. And they were very careful to cultivate Mullah Omar and his followers, and the Taliban that followed, even after the death of Mullah Omar. They have played this in the most sophisticated way possible. Sophisticated is a key word. Today's Taliban, those who just took power after the American withdrawal, are considerably different than the first generation of Taliban. If you see the pictures, this really illustrates it. The first generation of Taliban were very much drawn from these children. They were these boys. They grew up carrying weapons. They grew up knowing nothing but war. Nothing. And so when they finally took power, they had no idea how to exercise it. They had no idea what government really is. And so they continued to govern as if they were a militia among other militias. Immensely unsophisticated. The new generation of Taliban are much more urban. They have much more education. They are infinitely more sophisticated, and interestingly enough, they know the ways of business. But they face tremendous challenges. And these are challenges that the first generation of Taliban really didn't face. For one thing, and this is another of the great ironies of the conflict in Afghanistan, they now have to practice counterterrorism because ISIS, which has its own problems, is very strong in Pakistan. Now, there is a tradition that goes back centuries. But the first generation of Taliban practiced it, and the new generation of Taliban are trying to stop it for interesting reasons. Here's the game. When all of the tribal conflicts are settled by shura, shura means agreement, negotiation, and you have a relatively peaceful time, what do you do with the young guys who are fighters and have nothing to do other than turn on their own people or turn to crime? Well, the answer is always the same. There's the Hazara. The Hazara are the only Shiite tribe in Afghanistan. So what do? We go and attack the Hazara. They live in eastern Afghanistan, and they are pretty much helpless. Iran now supports them, interestingly enough, but that's another story. Well, let me go back to the myth of creation for a moment. Taliban as the protectors of women. Women may have no rights, women may not be able to work, but at least they were safe from rape, which was an astounding accomplishment. It really was, given what happened in the Civil War. First generation Taliban decided to do an anti-Shia jihad. They went to the Hazara, which is traditional. They killed a lot of Hazara, which is traditional. They raped Hazara women, which is not traditional. This is a society with no mass media. Internet connectivity is outside the cities, virtually non-existent. But the word of mouth is incredible. By the time this got to the other cities, and the news of it got to Kabul, this was one of the big reasons that the Taliban wore out their welcome. Westerners were looking at the public executions, which were barbaric and awful. But frankly, I'd seen worse in Saudi Arabia. They were looking at the flogging of women, which is terrible. But they were safe if they obeyed the rules. Now all the rules were broken. And the myth of the Taliban as progressive, a non-tribal actor, and as protectors of women was shattered. And so was the Taliban prestige. And pretty soon, the tribes were rising against them, particularly in the north. Well, enter ISIS. They first attack the airport and kill a lot of people with suicide bombs. But what is, in the long run, probably more important from an Afghan perspective is the attack on the Shia mosque, which happened just a couple of weeks ago. In creating this battle, which is traditional in many ways, against the Shia, they are essentially copying a very successful strategy that was employed during the Iraq War, which is you blow up a Shia sacred site and you start a civil war. That's what the Taliban are now trying to prevent. So in some strange way, they're now protecting the Shia. It's an interesting, very strange country. It's hard to understand from the outside. Moreover, another challenge that they face is from the northern tribes. When the US, in the period before the US invasion, even before they refused formally to return Osama bin Laden, CIA group went to Afghanistan and were talking to what was then called the Northern Alliance. These are tribal leaders of the northern tribes who have always opposed the Pashtun. And so they want to fight them. Well, the US said, this would be a great thing, and we will arm you to the teeth, and you can kill all the Pashtun you want. Which, of course, they took up. And pretty soon you had a nasty civil war which the Taliban was unable to put down. But the Northern Alliance was useless outside of the north. So Kabul remained fairly, unlike in the Civil War when Kabul was completely destroyed, Kabul was safe. But the northern tribes will, given first chance, rise against the new Taliban. That's simply the way Afghan history goes. Finally, Afghanistan remains what it has always been, a tribal society that is ungovernable from the center. Historically, the kings of Afghanistan are extremely weak. What they would do is have shifting alliances with the tribes, which they would constantly change to keep the tribes in balance. As soon as one became too progressive, as in Amanullah in the 1920s, everybody rises against them. He had this really terrible idea, by the way. Women should be educated. And it caused the whole country, it caused every tribe to rise against him. You can see the tribes and the sub-tribal groups. Afghanistan is what it always was, a tribal society where nothing really changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan, for your interesting ideas on Afghanistan and the current developments in the country. And finally, we will listen to Mr. Viktor Marsai. Viktor, please share your thoughts with us.
So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the two other speakers to speak about Europe and the European neighborhood and Afghanistan. And now in the last lecture of this evening, I will join to another continent, to Africa, to explain the rise of Black Jihad, the violent extremist organizations in Africa, and why we can speak about the new wave and why Africa is more and more important in the global jihad, while actually what we see, the strengthening of local groups which try to provide answers for local grievances and challenges. Also some sources in connection with the methodology of Diego. It was mainly news and interviews in different parts of the continent: Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Libya, and of course the secondary literature in the topic articles and books. So some introductory thoughts. What is important to underline, that jihad and violent extremist organization, of course, is not new in Africa. Just we can think for the movement of Usama the Folio on northern Nigeria, or the Mad Mullah in Somalia in the late 90s and early 20s. So actually this is the reason why we can speak a new wave, because there were many other waves of jihadist extremism in the continent. What we can observe, or could observe in the last 15 years, nevertheless, a rapid geographic expansion of the different groups and an increasing number of attacks in different parts of Africa. And what is very important, it's not just a quantitative change, but we see a qualitative change in the modus operandi and the tactics of and strategies of different groups. And what is also important, that we can observe increasing coordination and the transfer of know-how and modus operandi between the different hotspots of jihad in Africa. Some words about the expansion. You can see the map that in 2011, these were the main hotspots of jihadism in Africa. Actually, we could see no more than 7 countries affected by different violent extremist groups in the continent, mainly Somalia and Lake Chad Basin. 10 years after this, we see a massive concentration of hotspots in the continent and an increasing number of affected countries in the continent. 10 years ago, 7 countries had some level of jihadist insurgency in its territory. This year the number reached 19 with new bridgeheads in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Mozambique. And what absolutely changed the dynamic of these groups, their clear strategy to regionalize global jihadist efforts in the region, like in the Mali, Burkina, and Niger triangle, or in the Horn of Africa. And as I mentioned, we can observe also increasing number of attacks. These tables contains a demonstrated very well. And the number of fatalities, mainly in the Sahel region, which is the brand new hotspot of African jihadism, thanks to the rise of Jamaat al-Nasr Islam wal-Muslimin and the Islamic State affiliate, the Islamic State Greater Sahara province, which actually infected such countries like Burkina Faso or Niger, which previously hadn't met any form of global jihadism. And of course, the other hotspots like Boko Haram in northern Nigeria or Al-Shabab in Somalia and more Kenya also increased their operational tempo. And the number of fatalities also, after a short decline some years ago, unfortunately, the number of fatalities in this context also have risen. Yes. And now, okay. What is important, ladies and gentlemen, that in the last 15 years, some African countries managed to somehow get used to the jihadist activities. So they built up relatively strong security forces and they learned methods how to cope with the challenge. It's very visible in Kenya, which was totally unprepared for the first wave of Al-Shabab attacks in 2011, 12, and 13 in the country, and which caused a lot of havoc for Nairobi. It's changed in the last 5 years, thanks to partially the assistance of Western security services and trainers. But in the last 2-3 years, jihadists reached such countries, as I mentioned, for example, Burkina Faso or Mozambique, which hadn't got any knowledge how to cope with this challenge, and their security forces are not prepared to launch counterinsurgency or counter-violent extremist operation, which also contribute to the deepening of the crisis, because what we can see in the ground, in many cases, for example, the army of Burkina Faso arrived to a village when, according to rumors, there are some jihadists, and actually they massacre every man because they pretend that they belong to the jihadist groups, which actually just deepen the frustration among the local population, which, as we'll see soon, is a very important driving force for these insurgencies. Some words about the qualitative development. It's very important to underline that after Taliban, as Jeff mentioned, that which controlled territory and declared an Islamic State, actually the first jihadist groups which controlled huge areas and organized them with shadow government and control of population appeared in Africa, for example, Al-Shabab in Somalia. And in spite of the efforts of local armies and the international community, for example, the African Union in Somalia, these groups still, and nowadays why we are sitting here and listen to our lectures, controlling huge areas, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, where they are operating governments, collecting taxes, running madrasas, and recruiting people to participate attacks against the local forces and the international forces, and to be a good member of the jihadist movements. These are very important issues. And in spite of the efforts of international community and local actors, we couldn't cope with this challenge. And perhaps it's not so visible, but what you can see in the slide, actually the governmental structure of Al-Shabab in Somalia, which unit serves actually as a ministries of a government. Al-Shabab has a different ministries for financial issues, education, recruitment, policing, etc., etc. and they are working it in many aspects more effectively than the de jure government in Mogadishu, in the Somali capital. What changed also in the last years, the jihadists became more assertive. They regularly launch attacks against not just soft target, but hard military target, like forwarding operating base of different armies, international and national forces, and they're using these methods to demonstrate their capabilities to rule the countryside and jeopardize the credibility of central government, and demonstrate themselves, the jihadists, as actually the provider of security and services in the different areas. What changed in the last years was a definite shift from an ideological approach to a more practical and pragmatic approach, which significantly contributes to the increasing power and effectiveness of these groups. In their narratives, they still maintains this globalist and global jihadist approach, speaking, for example, after the Trump decision that they will liberate Al-Quds, Jerusalem, for the Crusaders and the invaders, etc., etc. But actually, they try to give answer for the local population and local marginalized communities, contrary to the central government. Okay, and we are now in one of the basic questions of African jihadist movements, that whether they are terrorists, in our perspective more or less, yes, and according to the perspective of local government they are, or insurgency groups which challenges local status quo and attack an oppressive central government, at least according to the narration of local marginalized group, and sometimes they are just employers who provide economic opportunities for marginalized communities in different parts of Africa. A job, joining a group and became a warrior, it's not just an ideological, it happens not only because of ideological reason, but as Muro mentioned in his presentation, economic factors in many aspects very important, because joining Boko Haram or Al-Shabab, it's also a career possibility for people in Somalia or northeastern Nigeria. Some examples how local jihadist groups and the franchises of Islamic states and Al-Qaeda utilize local grievances. In 2015, in the case of El Adde, it was a military base in Somalia. Al-Shabab successfully mobilized local clans, the Marahans, against the Kenyan troops, because they put it into a narration of a clan war between the Marahan, who control the land, and the Ogaden, a much bigger clan which wanted to build up some presence in the Marahan core area across the Kenyan troops. And in this example, Al-Shabab actually went to Marahan clan elders, and they discussed that if they can launch a common attacks against the KDF, the Kenyan Defense Forces, they can destroy the Kenyan base, and even they can push back the influence of Ogaden. So actually, local context, Al-Shabab appeared as a patron for the Marahan clan. Similar issue happened in Nampala in Mali, when Ansar ad-Din, the local jihadist group, demonstrated itself as a supporter of local Fulani tribes against the Bambara Bamako government and the Malian defense forces. Therefore, Fulanis provided hundreds of warriors to attack Mali military base. And 1 year later in Niger, it was a famous incident because 4 US Green Berets were massacred. And even that time, nobody knows that they are there in the middle of Niger. a similar issue happened when jihadists, at that time Islamic State Greater Sahara, has managed to convince local tribes that actually the Americans support another tribe. So actually, they share the positions of Americans with Islamic State, and they managed to kill 4 green birds. Jihadists also ready to utilize the ever-changing security environment. COVID-19 also demonstrated a possibility for them because it overstretched the capacities of the weak and fragile government of Africa. And it was utilized, as I mentioned, the jihadists. They increased the number of attacks against the different army positions. They increased recruitment activities in different parts of Africa. It was very easy, because tens of thousands of schools were closed during the pandemic in the continent, not only in Europe, but also in Africa. And last but not least, they utilized COVID-19 in their battles of narratives to argue that actually COVID-19 arrived to the continent also by foreign crusaders, paradoxically first by Chinese, of course, and after by Western crusaders. And in the narrative, it's regularly appear that actually COVID-19, it's a conspiration for Western powers to weaken the structures and the power of Africa. But also changed, as I mentioned, the jihadists built up a more complex networks of cooperation. What you see is a more and more unification between different fragmented groups. It is ongoing in the Sahara. What you see in the form of Jamaat al-Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin, which was built up by Ansar ad-Din Messina Liberation Front and Mujao. The sharing of information between the different groups. For example, how to use small drones during their operation, or how to produce ammunition by homemade ammunition to maintain their operations. Or what we could see, the unification of the Islamic State group in Mozambique and the DRC. And of course, what is also very important, the arrival of foreign fighters within and beyond from the continent to increase the training activities and the connections between the different groups. Last but not least, in this context, we should mention organized criminal networks in Africa, because it's also a problematic issue that whether we are speaking about jihadist, insurgency groups, or sometimes criminal networks, mainly in the Sahel, it's a problematic issue to make a clear distinction between these different groups. Actually, it's impossible. And perhaps you have heard about, it was one or 1.5 week ago, that actually it was a statement by the Hungarian government that will deploy Hungarian troops to Mali to support a counter-terrorism operation in the Sahel region. It will be very important to have a clear idea against whom we would like to fight in Mali in the coming years. And some conclusions, if it will work. But perhaps not, then I will conclude without the PPT. So ladies and gentlemen, what we see actually is a shift in the activity of the local African network. They realize that while they are maintaining their global narratives, actually they try to provide answer for the grievances and the problems of local communities. They are demonstrate themselves as patrons for local marginalized communities, whether they are ethnic communities or religious minorities or minority clans in different parts of the continent. And many people join to these groups not because of ideological reasons, but to jeopardize central government, which in their perspectives are many cases are oppressive or against Muslims, and they actually want to change the status quo and the balance in these countries. And this is the structural reasons why we can be sure that in the coming years the expansion of jihadist organizations in Africa will continue, and it will cause more and more trouble in different parts of the continent. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Viktor, for your presentation, and to all the three speakers. And now we will discuss some questions. Fortunately, I've received a couple, so I can ask all of our speakers. Maybe we should go in order or something like that. And I ask you kindly to be brief and short as much as possible. So maybe the first should go to Mr. Muro. It concerns your survey you just introduced to the audience. How do you explain the differences between country group responses? Are these culturally justified?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, actually, I mean, they're nationally bound. The reason why I presented two groups is because originally we listed in the report, for some answers, we have the 7 countries. And for not each question, but for many questions, you always have an outlier, right? Particularly the ones that have to do with war. So for example, the foreign policy of the West, Jordan, for example, was very critical. We have high responses, but of course they are very close to Syria, right? And they have suffered the result. But what we came to conclude is that the best way of presenting the data was to... Yeah.
I can hear you, of course,
okay.
but hopefully the audience as well.
But the best way of presenting the data was to create these two groups of Europe and Northern Africa, which we didn't want to do originally, but they made sense. And the discrepancies were even more important. Of course, there's also country variation between all the European countries. You know, we didn't get the same responses, but it made sense to present them in this manner, and that's how we got the most striking results. On top of this, I know this is not a brief answer, but on top of this, we also examined what women and youth thought, thinking that we were going to find something different there. We found no difference. Women and men have pretty much the same responses, and adults, or let's say middle-aged and youths, had the same responses as well. So in the end, that's why we presented it that way. Yes, so culture matters, definitely.
Culture matters also this time. Thank you very much. Our second question goes to Mr. Kaplan. So, what are the options for the international community when it comes to the recognition of or cooperation with the new Taliban regime in Afghanistan?
I would start with a historical answer. When the civil war ended and the period before the Taliban really took power, there was a debate in the US. And the debate went something like this. It was conducted between the intelligence communities and the State Department on the one hand, and the whole rest of the government on the other. Should we leave this as a vacuum, or should we go in and try to rebuild and establish a democratic state? They looked at the price tag and decided, we have finished with this. The anti-Soviet jihad was a success. The Soviet Union is about to collapse. It's all great. Who cares what happens in Afghanistan? And the result was the Taliban and all of the things that followed. It became a regional center of terrorism, and it became a regional center of instability in a very key region of the world geographically. At this point, the Taliban government is, as I say, much more sophisticated, with funding having dried up almost completely and international businesses pulling out of Afghanistan. They are desperate. There is probably an opportunity for constructive engagement. Probably. It would have to be done cautiously because, quite frankly, the ideology of the new, more sophisticated, kinder, gentler Taliban is exactly the same as the old Taliban. They just do it in a nicer way. So it would have to be a series of cautious incentives and rewards, but very cautious and very slow.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, one question for Viktor. What are the actual and potential migratory consequences of the spread and emergence of radical Islamist groups in the continent?
Yes, of course, war always calls refugees, so it's very obvious. What we can see now that most refugees in the continent are IDPs, so internally displaced person. If you are looking around, for example, in the Lake Chad Basin, because of Boko Haram insurgency, there are currently, according to growth estimation, 3 million people, and who was forcibly displaced, and 80% of them are within their nation, in Nigeria, Cameroon, and Niger, and a small portion in Chad. In European perspective, what can be more problematic is the Sahel region, the Mali, Burkina, Niger triangle, where there are also almost 3 million refugees and IDPs. And in the last years, we see that more and more people from Mali decide to try to utilize illegal migration routes. Because some years ago, Mali was more a transit country, and now it slowly became a country of origin. But the biggest challenge is definitely for the neighboring states. So I mentioned only 2 conflict zones. In this Boko Haram issue, and in Mali is 6 million IDP and refugees. So in general, it's the biggest challenges for Africa now.
Thank you very much for your answer as well. Thank you for the questions, dear audience. And I think all that's left for me today is to say thanks to our 3 speakers. And to all of you who followed our event in these late hours. And I encourage you to join our future events as well. And now please join us for a little reception after the event. And thank you very much for everything, gentlemen. Thank you.